Pie crust turned flaky with a splash of vinegar, pound cake lifted by 7-Up carbonation, custard pies set silkier with one can from the pantry shelf, all done without measuring cups or recipe cards. That knowledge lived in hands, not books. Here are 30 oddly useful soul food baking tricks that actually work. Nobody who grew up in one of these kitchens ever saw a measuring cup used for measuring. A palm of flour, a pour of buttermilk that looked right against the bowl, a pinch of salt tested between two fingers. This was precision of a different kind, built over years of baking the same things in the same cast iron until the hands knew more than any card could say. In West African culinary tradition, cooking by ratio and feel rather than fixed measurement was standard practice for centuries, and it traveled with the Great Migration into northern kitchens that had never heard of it. The trick is understanding relationships, not amounts. More fat means more tenderness, more acid means more rise. The women who never needed to write anything down had memorized chemistry without calling it that, and if you were lucky enough to stand beside one long enough, she handed you something no recipe card can hold. You could hear it before you saw it. The moment that batter hit the iron, there was a sound, a hard, immediate sizzle, like the pan was sealing a deal, and you knew the crust was already forming on the bottom before the top had even set. That sound was the trick. The cast iron had been heating in the oven for at least 10 minutes, and when cold batter touched that surface, the fat drove moisture into instant steam, puffing the inside while the outside crisped. This is why cornbread baked in a cold dish and cornbread baked in a screaming hot cast iron are two entirely different creatures from the exact same batter. African American cooks across the South understood this long before food science had a word for it. The skillet went in first always, and the batter went in last. You poured fast because every second of contact between cold batter and hot iron was building that crust. The dark gold bottom, slightly smoky from the seasoned surface, that was not an accident. That was something learned by listening. There was always a tin. It sat near the burner, dented and dark, with a lid that never quite closed right, and it was one of the most important pieces of equipment in the kitchen. Every time something came out of a pan, the drippings went in, the fat from salt pork, the leavings after the sausage was done, the amber oil left after cornbread came out. By the end of the week, that tin held a layered history of everything cooked, and it was the starting fat for nearly everything baked. Bacon grease keeps baked goods from sticking in a way butter never can. The smoke point is higher, the flavor deeper, and the way it coats seasoned cast iron before baking creates a seal that Crisco or spray oil cannot replicate. African American families across the South carried this practice from the 19th century straight through the 1970s. The ones who kept their tin long after health trends said otherwise. Their cornbread tasted different, richer, like something had been built into it slowly over years, because it had. No buttermilk meant a 10-second fix. You took whatever milk was left, poured a cup, added a tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice, stirred it twice, and let it sit for 5 minutes. What came back was close enough in chemistry to do the job. The acid had begun curdling the milk protein slightly, creating the tangy consistency that activates baking soda the way true buttermilk does. The acid-base reaction between buttermilk and baking soda is what produces the rise in quick breads. Carbon dioxide bubbles from chemistry, not just heat. African American bakers in the rural South, especially during the 1940s and 50s, when fresh buttermilk wasn't always available, knew this substitution by instinct. They didn't need a food chemistry textbook. They needed biscuits on the table by 6 in the morning, and the vinegar trick made that possible with whatever was left in the house. The buttermilk might be a workaround, but the fat was never negotiable. Before the dough was started, the butter, or lard, if that was what the kitchen kept, went to the coldest available place, the windowsill in winter, the back of the icebox, or a glass of cold water if nothing else worked. Cold fat is the entire secret to a flaky biscuit. When cold butter hits a hot oven, it creates pockets of steam as it suddenly releases, and those pockets become layers. Southern black bakers understood this for generations, even when the explanation lived in muscle memory rather than in words. The rule was simple: never let the fat warm up, work fast, and don't overwork the dough, because overworking activates gluten, and tight gluten is the enemy of a tender biscuit. You could feel when the dough was right, and you could feel the second it went wrong that you had held it one touch too long. White sugar does one thing, brown sugar does three. It sweetens, yes, but it also holds moisture. The molasses in brown sugar is hygroscopic, pulling water from the air and keeping baked goods softer longer. And it brings depth that refined white sugar cannot deliver. Something slightly caramel, the taste of the cane before all the complexity was processed away. African American bakers use brown sugar in sweet potato pies, in cornbread, in layer cakes long before the rest of American baking caught up. During the Depression and war years, when white sugar was rationed and tight, brown sugar was both cheaper and more available, and the baked goods from those kitchens were richer for it. Light brown sugar gives warmth. Dark brown gives depth close to molasses. The women who knew which to reach for never needed to explain why. The difference between a good custard pie and a great one often came down to a single small can. Evaporated milk from the shelf with the two punched holes in the top was not a shortcut in African American kitchens. It was a deliberate choice. Regular milk carries too much water, and in a custard filling, that excess dilutes the proteins that need to set the pie firm. The result weeps liquid into the crust and won't slice clean. Evaporated milk has had roughly 60% of its water removed, concentrating the proteins and milk sugars until it's nearly twice as rich. African American bakers adopted it in custard pies, sweet potato, chess, buttermilk, coconut, from at least the 1930s onward, when canned goods became staples in rural Southern households that couldn't count on fresh dairy every week. The silkier texture, the clean edge when cut, none of that came from talent alone. It came from knowing what was in the can and exactly why it worked better than what came out of the bottle. Between the 1920s and 1940s, the Southern kitchen slowly divided over pie crust, and the fault line was fat. One side stayed with lard, rendered from pork, used in African American kitchens for generations, its larger fat crystals creating distinct steam pockets that produce a shatteringly flaky texture no other fat can fully replicate. The other side switched to Crisco, marketed since 1911 as cleaner and more wholesome than animal fat. Many black households made the switch, but the ones who kept their leaf lard cold and kept rolling that dough the same way their mothers had, their crusts were different. A slight savory undertone balanced a sweet filling in a way that only lard achieves, and the texture shattered into clean fragments rather than bending. Food scientists eventually confirmed what those bakers already knew: leaf lard, rendered from fat around the pig's kidneys, produces the most tender pastry of any known shortening. The grandmothers knew that 50 years before anyone ran a lab test. Some of them are gone now, and the lard tins went with them. You never boiled them for pie. That rule was absolute and didn't need explaining. Boiling sweet potatoes for custard filling pulls water into the flesh. The potato becomes waterlogged, and no amount of oven time drives all that moisture back out. What you get is a filling that runs, a crust that absorbs liquid from below, a texture closer to puree than set custard. But roasted whole in a dry oven, pierced with a fork and left at high heat, the natural sugars caramelize inside the skin as water evaporates, the flesh concentrates, and the flavor shifts from plain sweet to something honeyed and slightly smoky at the edges. African American cooks across the Southeast held this distinction for generations, roasted for pies, boiled for savory dishes, choosing the jewel or garnet varieties for their dense orange flesh and high sugar content. You knew they were ready when the skin had tightened and split, and a slow dark drip of caramelized syrup had pooled on the pan below. If the sweet potato demanded patience, the biscuits demanded improvisation, and the tool was already on the table. In nearly every African American kitchen from the 1930s through the 1960s, there was a wide, heavy drinking glass with a second job nobody discussed. It just was the biscuit cutter, used so long that a faint ring of flour had worn into the rim. You press straight down, never twisted. Twisting seals the cut edges and prevents the layers from rising, and the glass left a clean circle that baked into exactly the size that kitchen had always made. The no twist rule is technical. A clean edge lets steam escape straight up through the open layers, creating the visible separation you can pull apart with your hands. The glass had the right rim. The woman pressing it knew the physics, even if she never used that word. And if the biscuit work took patience, it was nothing compared to what starting a pound cake properly required. 7 minutes. That was the standard in the kitchens where pound cake was taken seriously. Not 3, not 5, but a full 7 minutes of butter and sugar beating together before a single egg went in. By the end of it, the butter would be pale and nearly white. So aerated, it had roughly doubled in volume, and the sound of the beaters would have shifted from a dense thud to something lighter and faster. This was not decoration. The extended creaming process is what gives soul food pound cake its characteristic crumb and lift without extra leavening. The sugar crystals working against the fat over those 7 minutes cut millions of tiny air pockets into the butter, and those pockets carried the cake upward in the oven. The 7-up pound cake tradition, documented in African American households across the South since at least the 1950s, depended on long creaming plus soda carbonation together for its signature height. What you build in the first 7 minutes is what you taste in the last slice. The bowl of milk sat there for an hour, the liver submerged and slowly losing its edge. This was not fussiness, it was chemistry. Liver carries high concentrations of myoglobin, the iron-rich protein responsible for the metallic bitterness that puts people off organ meat, and milk's casein proteins bind to those bitter compounds and pull them away during the soak. What comes out of the milk bath is noticeably milder, with a cleaner flavor that accepts seasoning without fighting it. African American cooks across the South had practiced this for generations, reaching back to at least the early 20th century, when liver was among the cheapest proteins available, sold near free by butchers who considered it a throwaway cut, transformed into something worth eating by black cooks who wasted nothing. Some households use buttermilk in place of plain milk, adding acid to the process that drew out even more bitterness while tenderizing the exterior. Nobody learned this from a cookbook. You learned it by watching, by being told once, and by understanding that the knowing was not the same as the doing. The secret was a teaspoon of white vinegar worked into the dough just before the water went in, and most people who hadn't grown up in these kitchens had never heard of it. The chemistry is straightforward. Gluten develops when flour proteins are hydrated and agitated, and gluten is what makes pastry tough rather than flaky. Vinegar is a mild acid, and acid inhibits gluten formation, meaning a small amount added to pie dough actively resists the toughening that handling usually causes. African American bakers in the South incorporated this by at least the 1930s and 40s, passed down through women who made pies from scratch every week and had figured out by feel what the science would later confirm. Some combined the vinegar with a tablespoon of ice-cold vodka for an even more tender crust. Alcohol inhibits gluten even more aggressively than acid alone, and it evaporates cleanly in the oven without leaving flavor behind. You didn't need to understand any of that. You just needed to have watched someone do it once. There was a hierarchy to what went into that tin, and it was never spoken aloud. Salt pork drippings were common, reserved, used carefully, with the flavor carrying the smoke of whatever cut had rendered them. Bacon fat went in separately from sausage leavings because the two had different smoke points and profiles, and an experienced baker knew which to pull for biscuits versus cornbread. African American families in the rural South kept this system from at least the early 20th century through the 1960s and 70s, when cooking sprays and the store-bought shortening began draining the practice from kitchens that had maintained it for generations. When those women died, they didn't take a recipe. They took the knowledge of which fat to use for what and why the tin on the back of the stove was worth more than anything in the spice cabinet. But if the drip tin represented careful economy, fat saved, fat cataloged, used with precision, the mayonnaise cake represented something else entirely, a Depression-era act of radical substitution that worked so well it outlasted the crisis that invented it. The first published recipe appeared in 1927, and Hellmann's promoted it nationally by 1937. But in African American households, it spread the way most of this knowledge spread, through women telling other women, not through advertisements. The logic was brilliant. Mayonnaise is emulsified oil and egg yolks with acid, the same three components a cake asks you to add separately. One jar replaced the eggs, replaced the oil, and provided moisture that kept the crumb tender for days. The cake that came out was not a compromise. It was richer, moister, and lasted longer than the standard version. Some of the women who baked it every year until they were gone never knew they were using a Depression innovation. They just knew it was the one their mothers had made. Before bacon strips existed, those damp fabric bands sold today to keep cake layers from doming, the solution was a wet brown paper bag torn into strips, soaked in cold water, and wrapped around the outside of the pan before it went into the oven. The science is identical to the commercial product. Wet paper slows the rate at which the outer edge of the batter heats, allowing the center to catch up rather than setting the rim first and pushing the middle into a dome. The result is a flat layer that stacks evenly without needing to be leveled. African American bakers who made layer cakes for church suppers and holiday tables through the 1950s and 60s used this without specialty bakeware. The bags came from the grocery, cost nothing, and solved a problem that commercial bakers were charging money to fix. Nobody patented it, nobody published it, it just worked, and the women who knew it taught it to whoever was standing next to them. As soon as the layers came out of the oven, still warm, still fragile, the towels went on. Not dry ones, but kitchen towels dampened and wrung out, laid flat and waiting on the counter. Each layer turned out onto the towel, wrapped loosely and left to cool that way rather than on a wire rack. The damp cloth trapped the steam, still escaping from the hot crumb, holding it inside the cake instead of letting it drift away. The result was a layer with a noticeably moister interior, the kind of soft crumb that pulls apart without resistance and carries frosting the way a proper layer cake should. This step required nothing but a damp cloth and knowing to do it inside the 3-minute window before the steam left on its own. That window was the whole trick, and it was not written in any recipe. You had to be there to learn it. The measuring cup was wherever it was, and if you couldn't find it, you used the cup already on the counter. A standard coffee mug holds roughly 8 ounces, close enough to a cup that in most quick bread and cake recipes, the difference vanishes in the final product. African American grandmothers who had been baking by feel for decades occasionally conceded a measuring cup for the benefit of a grandchild who needed numbers, but the cup they handed over was often a jelly glass or a heavy mug from the cabinet. The real lesson was not precision, it was proportion. As long as the ratio of wet to dry stayed consistent, the vessel used to measure it was largely irrelevant. Baking chemistry operates on ratios, not absolute volumes. The women who knew this didn't explain it because they demonstrated it every time they baked. The grandchildren who watched carefully understood. The ones who asked too many questions were handed the cup and told to start measuring. Before the grease went on and before the flour went in, some bakers ran a wipe of white vinegar around the inside of the pan, a thin film, let dry, then greased and floured on top of it. The vinegar stripped residue from previous bakes, including soap traces from washing that can prevent the release fat from adhering cleanly to the metal. African American home bakers who used the same pans for decades, dark speckled steel or cast aluminum passed down from mothers who had received them from theirs, developed small rituals for maintaining those pans that no manufacturer ever recommended. The vinegar wipe was one of them, practiced in kitchens from Alabama to Chicago without ever appearing in a recipe card, taught only because someone was watching when it happened and thought to ask. If the pan tricks were about precision, the 7-Up pound cake was about something bolder, a wholesale substitution that rewrote what pound cake was supposed to need. The tradition is documented in African American households across the South since at least the 1950s. 1 bottle of 7-Up stirred into the batter in place of baking powder. The carbonation releases carbon dioxide bubbles when it contacts the batter's moisture and acidity, providing lift through the same mechanism as chemical leavening, but producing a crumb that is almost impossibly tender with a faint citrus note that no extract can replicate. Food writer Jocelyn Delk Adams documented learning this recipe at age 9 from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. A 3-generation chain passed through demonstration, not through a recipe box. The 7-Up cake never appeared in mainstream baking books. It didn't need to. Every woman who knew how to make it knew someone who needed to learn, and that was enough to keep it alive for decades. Florence English, known as Mama to the families who hired her catering operation out of Wilson, North Carolina, through the 1960s and 70s, stood barely 4 feet tall and ran her kitchen with complete authority. Her carrot cake was the dish people talked about for years after eating it, and the secret she carried was the egg whites. She separated her eggs, beat the whites to stiff peaks, and folded them into the batter at the very end, after the oil, after the sugar, after the grated carrots. The beaten whites created a cellular structure that trapped air in a way whole eggs cannot do on their own, producing a crumb that felt almost impossible for something baked in a dry oven. You couldn't get the technique from her recipe card because the card didn't include it. It was the steps she did after she put the card away. The ones who stood in her kitchen and watched were the only ones who learned it. Most of them are gone now. The wash went on last before the pie went into the oven. But in the kitchens, where this was done right, it wasn't an egg. It was evaporated milk, brush lightly across the top crust, sometimes with nothing but a folded piece of wax paper. Egg wash produces a deep shine that can turn almost mahogany at the edges if the oven runs hot. Evaporated milk produces a softer, more even golden color, the kind that looks like something made in a home kitchen, which it was. The milk sugars in evaporated milk caramelize at a lower temperature than egg proteins cook, so the crust colors evenly without the edges rushing ahead of the center. African American bakers who made pies for church dinners and holiday tables through the 1940s and 50s used this as a standard finishing step. It was one of those details only visible to someone paying close attention. The brush, the small can, the thin coat. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd never know it was the reason the crust looked the way it did. Nobody told you when the pie was done. You learned it by watching the oven, by being called over to look without touching anything, by standing close enough to see the motion when the rack shifted. A properly set custard pie, sweet potato, chess, buttermilk, coconut, jiggles in a specific way. The very center moves as a single unit, trembling slightly but not sloshing, while the outer 2 inches hold still. If the whole surface moves in waves, it needs more time. If nothing moves at all, it has gone too far and the filling has curdled. This test, passed down through African American kitchens that made custard pies from scratch every week, is a technique food scientists now teach in culinary schools. The eggs in a custard set at roughly 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and the residual heat after pulling from the oven finishes the job if you pull at the right moment. The women who stood at those ovens didn't know the temperature, they knew the jiggle, and they never pulled too early and they never pulled too late. Sifting flour was about more than removing lumps. It was about aeration, adding air to the flour before it ever touched the fat or liquid, so the final texture would be lighter than unsifted flour could produce. In many African American kitchens through the 1940s and 50s, a proper sifter was not always available or simply not at hand, and the workaround was exact. You held the flour bag over the bowl and tapped the side firmly, letting the flour fall in a slow stream rather than dumping it in a mass. The fall through the air served the same purpose as a sifter's mesh, breaking apart compaction, separating the particles, letting each one enter the batter individually. Cake flour measured this way produces a noticeably lighter crumb than flour measured by scooping and pressing. The women who had no sifter got the same result with a bag and a palm because they understood what the sifting was actually doing. Not every tool required a tool. Before parchment paper reached the rural South, before it was affordable or even available in the small stores that served many Black communities, cake pans and loaf tins were lined with flour sack cloth. The cloth came from the cotton sacks that held 50 pounds of flour, emptied and washed and set aside for exactly this second use. A well-scrubbed flour sack cut to size and pressed into a greased pan released the cake cleanly, no tearing, no sticking, nothing lost. The flour companies that sold to Black communities knew their customers were keeping the sacks, and some eventually printed the fabric with patterns, flowers, small geometric prints, pale checks that women could sew into garments after the cloth had served the kitchen. Flour sack dresses were common in the rural South through the 1930s and 40s. Flour sack pan liners were common even longer. The knowledge of which sack fabric made the best liner, how to prep it, when to discard it, that was part of running a kitchen that wasted nothing and asked nothing of the world that it couldn't solve with what it already had. The butter was for the table. The grease was for the work. When a pan needed to be ready before a batter was ready to go in, bacon drippings went on with a folded cloth or a piece of wax paper rubbed into every corner, every seam. Butter burns at a lower temperature than rendered pork fat, roughly 350 degrees versus the 400 and beyond that a well-seasoned cast pan or dark steel often reached in an older oven with inconsistent heat. Butter would scorch the outside of a cake before the interior set. Bacon grease would hold steady, brown slowly, and release the cake cleanly. African American bakers across the South and in northern cities, they'd migrated to use this distinction every time they baked, even as their neighbors switched to commercial sprays and shortening papers. Some of them kept a separate cloth just for greasing pans, reserved for that purpose and never washed with soap that might leave a residue. When those women were gone, the cloth got thrown out with everything else nobody knew to keep. Before candy thermometers, before deep fried thermometers with their little red dials, before any tool that read a number, there was a drop of batter. You let one fall from your fingertip into the oil, and what happened in the next 3 seconds told you everything. If it sank to the bottom and sat there, the oil was too cold. If it hit and immediately turned dark, the oil was too hot. If it sank halfway, paused, then rose and began to sizzle actively at the surface, turning gold in a steady, controlled way, the oil was ready. African American cooks across the South had refined this test through generations of frying, from donuts to hush puppies to the small fried pies that moved from cast iron to paper bag before they were eaten. The drop didn't measure temperature, it measured behavior, and behavior was what mattered in the pan. Nobody who knew this test needed a thermometer. They needed one good drop and the patience to read what it told them. The bread went stale on purpose, or if it didn't, the woman who found it stale knew immediately what it was for. Brown Betty, bread pudding, savory stuffings, all built on the principle that day-old bread with its moisture partially gone absorbed custard or molasses more completely than fresh bread could. Fresh bread has active starch cells that resist absorption. Stale bread has open cells that drink. The earliest known written Brown Betty recipe dates to 1864, though the dish was already old by then, built in enslaved kitchens where bread scraps arrived without having to be asked for, used in desserts that fed the whole household from what the household would otherwise have discarded. Through the 1930s and into the 50s, African American grandmothers made bread pudding from whatever loaf had sat too long, sweetened with brown sugar and whatever spice was in the cabinet. It vanished from tables when using stale bread seemed like something people no longer needed to do. The razor blade was kept in a small drawer near the counter, specifically for bread. Before a loaf went into the oven, the surface of the dough got scored. 3 or 4 quick diagonal cuts across the top, shallow enough not to deflate the rise, but deep enough to matter. The cuts were not decorative, they were structural. During baking, bread expands as the internal steam pushes outward, and if the crust has no planned openings, it will find its own, tearing in random places along the weakest seam, producing an uneven loaf with a ragged surface. The scores control where the expansion happens, directing the rise upward through the slashes rather than outward through the sides. African American home bakers who made yeast bread through the 1940s and 50s used this technique with whatever sharp tool was available, a paring knife, a razor, the thin blade of a small knife moved fast enough not to drag. The pattern of the cuts varied by household, the number by habit, the angle by what had been done in the kitchen before that woman was the one doing it. The last thing she did before a batter went into the oven was nothing. The bowl sat on the counter for 10 minutes, sometimes 15, covered with the cloth, untouched. In that rest, the flour fully hydrated. The starch granules absorbed every molecule of liquid, the gluten relaxed, The leavening began its first slow work before any heat arrived. The result of a rested batter is measurably different from one that goes straight into the pan. The crumb more even, the rise more consistent, the center less dense. Pastry chefs now teach this as standard practice for quick breads and muffins. The grandmothers who did it didn't need a culinary school to tell them. They had made the same batter long enough to know what happened when you waited and what happened when you didn't. The bowl sat, the batter rested, and when it finally went into the pan, everything that had been set in motion had the time it needed to become what it was meant to be. Most of that knowledge is gone now. What remains are the recipes, not the hands, not the patience, not the knowing when to stop and wait. Molasses cake was the closest thing to dessert most enslaved people would taste at Christmas, baked in cast iron skillets over cabin fires. Molasses was the cheapest sweetener, the dark byproduct of sugar refining that plantation owners considered beneath their tables but distributed to quarters. Mixed with cornmeal or rare wheat flour, eggs when available, and gathered spices, the batter baked into dense, moist cake with deep, almost burnt sweetness. The flavor was intense, far removed from delicate cakes served in the big house, but beloved in its own way. Women who made exceptional molasses cake earned reputations spreading across plantations, their recipes guarded and whispered. Children hovered near the fire, watching for signs the cake was ready. Each slice represented weeks of careful hoarding, extra molasses saved, flour hidden away, eggs collected one by one until enough existed to create something truly celebratory from almost nothing.
Sweet potato pone was the Christmas dessert, transforming root cellar staples into something approaching luxury during the leanest years. Grated sweet potatoes were mixed with molasses, flour, spices, and whatever fat was available, then baked slowly until the top caramelized into sticky darkness. The texture fell between pudding and cake, dense and satisfying with edges that crisped into chewy candy. Sweet potato pone cost almost nothing, since potatoes stored through winter and molasses was cheaper than sugar. The dish connected families to African foodways, where yams and sweet potatoes held ceremonial importance. Some cooks added dried fruit when available, though the basic version needed nothing more than potatoes and sweetener to satisfy. Neck bones and rice stretched Christmas protein further than any other dish, feeding large families on the cheapest cuts available at butcher shops. Pork neck bones were browned until deeply caramelized, then braised slowly with onions, garlic, and bay leaves until meat fell from bone. The rich gravy formed during cooking was spooned generously over mounds of fluffy white rice, each grain soaking up smoky, savory goodness. Mothers made this when budgets stretched thin, but tables still needed to look full and festive for visiting relatives. Neck bones cost almost nothing at counters, where prosperous customers ignored them. The dish proved skilled cooks could transform overlooked ingredients into something everyone requested year after year.
Hog jowl and black-eyed peas carried deep meaning for enslaved communities, especially during Christmas when slaveholders sometimes distributed extra pork rations. The jowl was fatty cheek meat, considered undesirable by wealthy families, but treasured in quarters for its rich flavor and ability to season large pots. Black-eyed peas simmered slowly with the jowl until creamy and infused with smoky, salty essence. This combination became associated with luck and prosperity, beliefs enslaved people held fiercely despite their circumstances. One hog jowl could flavor enough peas to feed an entire cabin, stretching limited rations further than seemed possible. Women woke before dawn on Christmas morning to start the pot, knowing it needed hours to reach perfection. The peas were easy to grow and store, making them a reliable staple. This dish was more than sustenance. It was an act of hope, a belief that better days might come despite all evidence to the contrary.
Sorghum popcorn balls appeared on Christmas tables throughout Black households where both ingredients grew abundantly and cost almost nothing. Popcorn was popped over wood fires, then drizzled with hot sorghum syrup, boiled to the perfect sticky stage. Buttered hands shaped the mixture into balls while still warm, pressing firmly so kernels held together. The syrup added deep, earthy sweetness that refined sugar could never match, complementing the toasted corn perfectly. Children received these as Christmas gifts, wrapped in waxed paper or tucked into small bags. Sorghum popcorn balls represented the ingenuity of families who grew their own sweetener and corn. The treats lasted for days, carried in pockets and nibbled slowly to make Christmas stretch as far as possible. Cornbread dressing was the soul of Christmas dinner, its savory richness anchoring the entire holiday meal in African American homes. Mothers crumbled day-old cornbread into enormous bowls, mixing it with sautéed celery, onions, and sage that perfumed kitchens. Chicken broth moistened the mixture while beaten eggs bound. Everything together into perfect texture. Some families added giblets or crumbled sausage, depending on regional traditions and budget. The dressing baked until golden on top and custardy inside, its edges crisping into coveted portions. Unlike bread stuffing, cornbread dressing carried distinctly Southern heritage that Black families treasured. It stretched to feed crowds, since cornmeal cost pennies, and transformed into enough for the entire extended family.
Sweet potato pone was a Christmas dessert requiring nothing more than sweet potatoes, molasses, and knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. Potatoes were roasted until soft, mashed with molasses, a little lard, and spices like ginger when available. The mixture was pressed into a pan and baked slowly until set into dense, sweet cake that could be sliced and eaten cold over several days. The texture fell somewhere between pudding and candy, smooth and sticky with concentrated sweetness, making children's eyes go wide. Sweet potatoes grew well in small plots. Enslaved families were sometimes permitted to tend, making them one of the few ingredients people could control. The pone represented agency, a dish made entirely from ingredients grown and prepared by enslaved hands without slaveholder involvement. Families made extra pones to share with neighbors, spreading Christmas joy through food when no other gifts were possible.
Horehound drops were the old-fashioned Christmas candy connecting Black families to herbal traditions stretching back generations. The bitter herb grew wild throughout the South, gathered freely from roadsides by those who knew where to look. Horehound leaves were steeped into strong tea, combined with sugar, and boiled into hard candy that soothed sore throats while satisfying sweet cravings. The flavor was intensely herbal with bitter undertones balanced by sweetness, an acquired taste children learned to love. Mothers made these as medicine and treat combined, giving them throughout cold winter months. The drops cost nothing but labor since the herb grew wild, and sugar could be bartered cheaply. Horehound drops represented folk knowledge passed through generations. Chitlins carried deep tradition to African American Christmas tables, their preparation a ritual connecting generations through labor and love. Pig intestines required hours of careful cleaning, soaked and scrubbed repeatedly until meeting the exacting standards of grandmothers who accepted nothing less. The clean chitlins were simmered slowly with onions, vinegar, and red pepper flakes until tender, filling homes with distinctive aroma. Families debated proper preparation, some preferring them boiled soft, while others fried them crispy in cast iron. The dish cost pennies since butchers sold intestines cheaply to those who knew their value. Chitlins appeared at Christmas because holidays provided time for hours of preparation, transforming scraps into delicacy that honored ancestors.
These tricks belong to kitchens that are going quiet. If any of this lived in yours, leave it in the comments before it disappears.